Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the Sewell Leader Live Leadership Cast. This morning I'm with Dr. Ray Perryman. If you joined us last week, you were able to see Dr. John Maxwell, Mark Cole, and myself really talk about what leadership looks like in really tough times. And my guess is for you, for me, for all of us, we truly today are living unprecedented moments. And so we felt like it was really important not just to have a one-time leadership live conversation, but for me to be able to find all of the people I could, the connections and friends that I have around the world, to be able to bring to you information. And if you remember what Dr. Maxwell and I shared with you last week, John said that Max Dupree said that the first responsibility of a leader was to define reality. The second responsibility was to offer hope. And the third was to take massive action. In a time when we're not able to get physically together, with the wonderful invention of the internet and social media, we have the opportunity to connect and relate in a way that we have never dreamed possible. I used to say last week, welcome on behalf of the Permian Basin, but I will say today, thank you for joining us from across the world. Last week, after the Leadership Live broadcast, I had a new friend from Uganda, Africa, send me a message saying that they had listened in to the Leadership Live cast. And so as a result today, for the world, welcome. I have an incredible honor of knowing Dr. Ray Perryman for many years. He's been a mentor and a friend, and he also is considered one of the foremost experts in economics, not only in the United States, but across the globe. The fortunate thing is that he lives in our hometown of Odessa, Texas. And so in just a few minutes, I want to be able to turn this over to Ray. He's going to speak to you for maybe 30 to 45 minutes. And during that time, as you have questions, if you will send those to us on Facebook Live, we're going to try to take as much time as we can after Ray's message and answer those questions for you. So make sure you send them early so that we can really get those aggregated and get the most and the best, most thorough questions to Ray so that hopefully we can have a better understanding and we really can define reality for ourselves and not be confused by opinion, but rather have the facts. And before I turn this over to Ray, I want to say thank you to my staff and my team who have realized and found out how we make this a reality. I'd like to thank Crossroads Fellowship, who's allowed us to use their facility today to make this a reality, and so many of you who have continued to not only pray for me, but our entire team and our nation. With that said, Ray, thank you for taking time to be with us today. Thank you for being willing to share of your time. I guess the good news is for us, you were available. The bad news is you were available. So with that said, I'm going to turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Collin. I appreciate it. And I would like to join Collin in thanking everyone on the Sewell team for putting this together under fairly difficult circumstances and the folks at Crossroads for giving us access to this great facility. I am going to try to define the problem and suggest what some of the actions might be. For those of you who are not from the Permian Basin who are watching, I'm standing in one of the areas where we have probably two concerns that are competing for which one's the most important right now, given the situation in the oil and gas industry, which is so important to our area. And so I'm going to try to spend some time on both of them. They're linked together in some ways, they're not in other ways. And I'm going to just try to define some of this for you in a way that through my lens, and my lens is economics. And it's unusual, it's atypical to have a situation like this because normally when we have a big economic issue, it's because of something structural. We did something we shouldn't have done with mortgages or .com stocks or savings and loan lending or whatever the case may be, or it's some type of outside force similar to this one, but not of a health nature. It's a terrorist action. It's an embargo. It's those kinds of things. You have to go back more than 50 years to find a single recession in this country that wasn't caused by either us creating our own problem some way structurally or it being something from the outside. And I've been saying for quite some time, in all probability, the next one we would have to deal with would be something from the outside. And of course, here it is. And so it's an atypical situation. The other thing about it is that makes it different is normally when we have something like this, they lock some of us in a room and say, figure something out. And this one is fundamentally a health crisis. And consequently, the last thing in the world you need to do when you have a health crisis is lock a bunch of economists in the room to figure out a solution, because that would not be the thing to do. You need to, obviously we have to rely on our health professionals and our health expertise and our bioscientists, virologists, and all those folks to help us work through this. It's a different type of economic problem than some of the others we've had. So having said all that, I want to try to take you through my lens, and one of the first things we do when we try to look at something is we try to figure out a way to model it and figure out something about it, and I'll share some of that with you in a few minutes. But the other thing we do is try to say, what can history teach us about this? And sometimes it can teach us a lot, and sometimes it can't teach us too much, but normally you can find some parallels in history. This one's a little tough, but there is at least one parallel in the United States that does give us some insight into some things about it, and that is the so-called Spanish flu. For those of you who are interested, it probably did not originate in Spain. It was in 1918. It was over a century ago. We were just coming out of World War I. And as a result of that, because of the war situation, a lot of the media in Europe was censored. Spain was neutral, so Spain was not censored. So they covered it in a big way. And so everyone came to associate it with Spain because they talked about it all the time. And so, but in any case, it was devastating, and people forget how bad it was. I mean, the population of the United States at that time was a little over 100 million people. Probably 30 million of people got that flu, and over 600,000 died. I mean, we lost 600,000 people in a short period of time with the Spanish flu. So it was a very, very big situation. So there are some things we can learn from that. Obviously, it was a very different economy back then. We were not a major world power. The Federal Reserve was only 5 years old, was just getting its sea legs, did not have the authorities and the abilities it has now. We did not know as much about policy as we know now. So there were a lot of differences, but there are some things from that we can take and learn from, and I'll try to bring some of those in as we go along here. I hate to turn into an economics lecturer. I always hated that when I was in college and even when I was a professor, but I will try to right now very briefly take you through a fairly important concept. Many of you will be familiar with it, but many of you may not be. And it's very important to what we're seeing right now and to how this thing is unfolded. And that's the difference between uncertainty and risk. We use the terms interchangeably in common usage all the time, and that's fine. There's no reason not to. But they have fairly specific meanings in the economic and financial world. Risk is something that we deal with every day. People determine they'll take a risk to start a business, to change jobs, to move to a new location, to bring out a new product, whatever the case may be, to buy a stock, to buy a bond. That's the kind of risk that we take. We don't know the outcome, but we sort of have an idea of the distribution of possible outcomes. And consequently, we can make a decision. This one has more risk, more potential return. I like that. This one has less risk. I like that. We can all make our decisions based on our tolerance for risk and where our station in life and our resources and that sort of thing. But we have some framework to make those decisions. And that's what drives markets, is the fact that different people have different risk tolerances. That's why you have buyers and sellers, which is what it takes to make a market. And so as a result of that, risk is something that I think everybody would like to have a little less of it, obviously, but it's one of those things that basically we live with, and it's part of sort of what we've institutionalized. Uncertainty is a different animal. That's when you don't know the distribution. And that's what this has created. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't have a clue what it's going to look like. And when that happens to investors and companies and people, the natural tendency psychologically is go to the sidelines. Don't take risks because we can't measure those risks. We can't understand those risks. We don't know what's happening. And as a result of that, when this first started, you saw these massive sell-offs in stock, not based on information, but based on lack of information. People didn't know what was coming, and so consequently, they reacted that way. And if you look through history at various times, and you evaluate the history of equity markets, going all the way back to when Wall Street was a street having to do with a wall that was put up in the Dutch settlement era. Basically, if you go back all the way through history with markets, you find if you give a market a choice of good news, bad news, or uncertainty, that's the order in which they'll pick them. They prefer good news, but if they have to pick between bad news and uncertainty, they'll take bad news Because once you know what it is, you can define it and you can set a price. And markets are based on being able to set prices. And so that distinction is very important. And right now we have a lot of uncertainty. And as we get this defined more, which we seem to be doing as we go along here, as we get more definition and more information, that in and of itself will be something that helps us some, because at least at that point in time, a lot of people may not like the prices, but the market can set a realistic price. Right now, all the money is going to the sidelines. I mean, we're throwing out money like crazy from the United States, and yet our interest rates on Treasury debt and that sort of thing are getting very close to zero. I mean, people are wanting to hold cash. They're wanting to hold liquid assets, and they don't want to do anything. And we have an economy that's based on people doing something, whether it's a job, a new business, a new product, whatever the case may be. That's what we base things on. And consequently, when that goes away, that in and of itself puts a big crimp on the economy. And we sort of saw this thing unfold in waves. The first thing we noticed was, as it began to afflict China, obviously that brought up a couple of issues for us in the very short term economically. Number one, China makes a lot of the input parts to things we make here, particularly in electronics and industries like that. And so consequently, we started developing supply chain problems. We no longer keep months and months of inventory around like we used to. So we started seeing supply chain problems, and those started causing some problems in the economy. And consumer products. China makes a lot of our consumer products. We began to see some shortages of some of the consumer products and that sort of thing. That was the first thing we began to notice with this. Then as the world economy was slowing down, obviously oil demand was slowing down, so we started noticing oil prices and a drop some down into the low 40s and in that area. And so the second wave was sort of oil prices and things that happened there. And then we got into the situation of where we realized this was coming here, it was significant, and we started seeing the travel restrictions. A very big watershed moment here in Texas was when they canceled South by Southwest, because a week later there were supposed to be 500,000 people coming to Austin. Those kinds of things started to matter, and now, of course, we're seeing a lot of places sheltering in place, a lot of restrictions throughout the country, and so you're seeing that wave set in now in terms of what's happening. So it's been kind of a set of waves here, and we were crazy enough, I guess is the right word, to try to model this. We do a lot of modeling. We have some very, very big systems we've maintained over the last 40 years or so, and we've taken a stab at it, and I will tell you right away, much like making a financial decision, modeling under uncertainty is very, very difficult. And we don't know what's going to happen, and we can't tell you what's going to happen. What we can do is tell you what we did and then tell you what the results are, and it gives you kind of a realistic framework for what we might come to expect out of this. And the way we went about it was fairly systematic. We gathered a lot of information on all the various industries, literally hundreds of industries, what's happening in them now, what are their trade associations saying, what have other countries who got this a little before we did, what did they experience in those industries, what are commentators saying about the industries, what are professionals in the industry saying. We went through that for hundreds of industries and said, okay, this is what it looks like their initial hit is going to be. And then we took a very large system, and I won't go into the details, but it's a dynamic system that measured all the interactions among all the industries and that sort of things and allows things to change in it. And we said, okay, what if, what are all the implications of that? How does it play its way out in the economy? And then we threw in a big stimulus package, because that appears to be something that's going to happen. We threw in some of the current Fed policies and that sort of thing. So we've accounted for a lot of things, but we haven't accounted for everything because we don't know everything. And the models aren't perfect even if we did know everything, but there's a lot we don't know. But given kind of a realistic picture of how this is playing out and how it might play out, how long it might last, what the recovery might look like and that sort of thing, we're seeing today, we're seeing overall that the U.S. economy will stand to lose out of this almost $1 trillion in gross product. Now, we're a $20 trillion economy, so that's a very big number. And about 12 million jobs. And that's a very big number. That's over 7% of our current employment workforce. The thing to remember about that, though, a couple of things. Number one is that's measured in full-time equivalent jobs. A whole lot more people will be affected than that. Because if you have one person who loses a job for 4 months, another one loses for 4 months, and another one loses for 4 months, that's one full-time equivalent job for a year. So even though you're talking about 12 million full-time equivalent jobs, there's a lot more people and families that are going to be affected by this, and it gets to being a very significant percentage of the population. Exercises like this are interesting because some industries are seeing some growth right now. Some aspects of transportation are really taking you on the chin, but those that do deliveries and that sort of thing are growing a lot. And so we're seeing that sort of thing happen. We're seeing obviously the health sector is seeing some growth right now. The food grocery store sectors are seeing some growth. So there's areas that are seeing growth in the midst of the decline, and that's the way it always happens in a complex and dynamic economy. But we try to take assessment of all that and look at the patterns and see where we came out. And so that's not a prediction or anything, but it's kind of a sense of the order of magnitude of what we're probably looking at here. We'll be releasing those numbers in a big release later today, or they'll be on our website later today at perrymangroup.com, and you can just go pull them down. We have some numbers by industry and a number of things there that you might find interesting. But in any case, so that's kind of what we're looking at, which is all that to say it's a big, big, big problem. Now, we need to talk about the policy aspect of it for a few minutes here. The recovery from this is going to be very interesting, and we don't know what it's going to look like yet. But if we go back and look at what history has told us that economies are capable of recovering very, very, very quickly sometimes. On average, they recover fairly quickly. If you look at all the recessions prior to 2008 in our economy, the average recovery period was about 11 months. I mean, we made up everything and then started and then some in about 11 months. These don't tend to be long. Many of them have been far less than that, 6 or 7 months. Recoveries can happen very quickly. Economies are very resilient and they can come back. And one interesting thing about this one is this was not a structural problem in the economy. So there's not something we had to go fix in the economy to make it come back. This is a health crisis that has led to an economic crisis. And the implication of that is if we can keep the structure together and keep it functional, then we can come back from this very quickly. And you might think, wow, with everything going on, that sounds impossible. Let me give you just a couple of examples. Let's go back to that Spanish flu for a minute. 2018-19, hundreds of thousands of people losing their lives, millions of people infected, lots of things shut down, lots of things happening, a very, very difficult situation. If you put it in relative terms, it was worse than the worst case this is likely to be. So, I mean, we've seen something like this in 2018-19. The decade after that was known as the Roaring Twenties. It was one of the fastest growth periods in the history of our country was the 1920s. So we came back from that very quickly. It's amazing how fast economies can adjust sometimes when there's not a real structural problem. A simpler example close to home here in Texas is, for some reason years ago, I saw an article and I thought it was humorous, so in the midst of some bad times, and so I hung on to it for a while. But there was an article in Austin back in 1990, and for those of you who don't remember, that was the real estate bust, the savings and loan bust, the oil bust. It was a very bad time for Texas. Real estate was really taking it on the chin. There was an article in 1990 that said Austin had a 25-year supply of real estate, that nothing would be built for 25 years. Even those of you who are not from Texas probably know Austin's built a little bit of stuff in the past 25 years. But in 1993, just 3 years later, Austin was the #1 real estate market in the country. So these things can happen. They can recover very quickly, but it's critical that you keep the infrastructure together. And that's what policy needs to be about right now. We talk about Fed policy, and they're doing a lot of things. They've taken interest rates down to zero. They were already very low. They've taken interest rates down to zero, and that will help some. But the bigger thing they're doing is they're saying, we're going to do whatever we need to do to keep the corporate debt market functional. We're going to do whatever we need to do to keep the mortgage security market functional. They are doing the things right now. They're bold, aggressive moves, and I can promise you in a few years they'll be criticized for them. I was on some of the phone calls back in 2008 when they decided to do all the things they did, and years later they were criticized and said, well, the world didn't fall apart. Well, the reason the world didn't fall apart is because they did what they did, and so that's the nature and evolution of the process. But what we like to see policy do is get us an immediate result. Nothing the Fed does right now is going to get us an immediate result. It's just not going to happen. And if you stop and think about it, there's a reason for that. Interest rates went down a 1.5 points. How many of you out there today, if you think about yourselves, would a drop in your interest rate cause you today, in the situation we're in, to run out and buy something? I dare say not very many, because that's not what we're reacting to right now. This uncertainty and not knowing the situation, that's what's doing. How many of you would it make you run out and start a business or run out and invest in something? Probably very, very few. And that's the whole point. The policies are not going to give you an immediate effect. Now, they will help us when the comeback starts. Lower interest rates can help accelerate it. And that's very important. And that's one of the reasons why we could have a fairly rapid recovery here if we keep the infrastructure together. But it's the other piece of Fed policy that doesn't get as much attention that's just making the markets continue to function. That's a very, very important part of what we're doing right now. And yes, it will cause some things down the road we don't like, and there'll be criticism of it after the fact. But right now, we're much like the health sector, the economic sector is having to make some tragic choices here. We're having to make decisions about which problems do we treat and how many consequences do we deal with. And we certainly don't want the cures to be worse than the disease from the economic standpoint, but the cures may be fairly painful down the road at some point. Then we get to the fiscal policy side of it, and Congress is now getting together and seems to be working toward a package right now that's fairly significant. And it's a very big package. I mean, we're a $20 trillion economy, and we're talking about a $2 trillion package. That's very, very, very big. But it's also something that's probably necessary. Remember, I just told you our scenario, which is fairly realistic, shows that we would lose $1 trillion in the economy even after you put the stimulus package in. So it may not even be the only stimulus package we see. Now, the critical thing is we need to make sure it is focused on fixing the problems, and the critical thing, keeping the infrastructure, keeping the structure of the economy together so we function beyond this. That's the key point of the policy. And that has several elements to it. Small businesses that are viable otherwise need to be able to stay in business. Large organizations that are suffering, like the airline industry right now, need to have some way to recover from this. And there are ways to structure that. We saw it in 2008 with the auto industry and the banks, where down the road the government actually makes money off of it because you're not taking an industry that's fundamentally broken and patching it back together. You're taking a fundamentally okay industry and you're giving it a way to get through an unprecedented crisis. And then after the fact, you can collect the money back. And that's what we did before. We can do those same kinds of things again. The one mistake we made in 2008 in our policy process was, and I think this is important, I mentioned every other recovery on average has been a year or so, many of them much less. That recovery took 58 months to get back to even. The reason it took 58 months was we fixed one side. We dealt with the auto industry. We dealt with the banks. We didn't deal with the people who were losing their homes. So we didn't fix the individual piece of our economic structure in the way we should have. Hopefully that lesson is and as a result, the recovery was very, very, very slow in that time around. It lasted a long time once it got going, but it was very, very slow recovery and very frustrating recovery in some ways. This time around, people seem to be focused on the fact that people are losing their jobs, people are having health care expenses, people are suffering, and so we have to focus on that as well. We have to. So you need both pieces of it. And I can assure you, again, in the political process, a number of folks are going to vote for this, of different political stripes. And down the road, somebody will run against a liberal and say they voted for a corporate bailout. And somebody will run against a conservative and say they voted for welfare. I mean, that's just the nature of what we're going to see in the political process. That doesn't matter. I mean, this is the time we have to step up and do those things. Will it balloon the deficit? Absolutely. Is that a good thing? Absolutely not. Do we have any choice? Absolutely not. Now, the critical thing is when we do this and do it to be smart about it. For example, with small business, government has a real habit of doing some things to help small business, but doing them with so much complication and so much paperwork and so much delay that it takes a long time to get something done. We can't do that now. You've got to get these businesses they're hurting now. They might be fine in 6 or 8 months if they get by now. And so consequently, we've got to make sure that these are things that will get the relief where it needs to be as it needs to happen. And if you go back in our history and look at some of these things, I'll talk a little bit more of this later, that really is fundamentally part of what Western civilization is all about. We just kind of lost sight of it over the years. There was a very definitive role for government in John Locke and Adam Smith and David Ricardo, whoever you want to read, who's about how we formed our government, how we evolved our systems. All the people that Mr. Jefferson and others were reading at the time, they were creating this new experiment over here. These things were all a part of it, and we're somewhat getting back to that. Now, I mentioned one of the things that happened was the oil price started to go down, and now it's worth talking about oil for a few minutes. Again, for those of you who are in the Permian Basin, obviously it's top of mind for everyone. For those of you who are not, it is a very fundamental part of what's going on here. And I want to try to do a little bit of a deep dive on that for a few minutes, and then hopefully I won't talk so much that I take up all the time we could otherwise use for questions and dialogue. But if you look at the oil and gas industry right now, And you see, it has changed a lot in recent years. It's a very, very different industry than it used to be. And the Permian Basin, where we're standing today, is the epicenter of that change. I mean, we went from 35 years of decline in oil, drop of 2/3 from our prior peak production, to twice what our production has been. We went from a couple of decades of reserves to a couple of centuries of reserves. There's been a lot of things that happened along the way, and I don't want to go into all those dynamics right now, but what I'm trying to say is this is a very different situation than what we've seen before, but it looks a whole lot like what we've seen before. And we need to talk about that. The first oil well was drilled out here and brought in 1920. So we literally have a century of seeing the same type of cycle, boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. The cycles of the future are going to be different, but because of the way this one happened, the unprecedented nature of it and the severity of it, it looks like what we've seen before. And it won't look like it coming out of it if we do things right, but it does look like it going into it. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about that right now and sort of what we're seeing here and how it happened, why it happened, how it may play out over time. Obviously, like everything else, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. But as the price began to fall, obviously that caused some concern on the part of oil producers around the world. And the so-called OPEC plus cartel, which is OPEC plus Russia, they've been meeting with Russia the past few years, got together to try to take a look at this. And the idea Saudi Arabia had in calling this meeting was, let's lower oil production some during this time when we don't need as much. And they went into it with every intention of doing that. They said that to Russia, and Russia said, nope, we're not going to do that. And so then Saudi Arabia said, okay, then we're not going to do it either. And it's a very interesting time in history right now as all this is playing out. Because what's happening is, first of all, both the MBS and President Putin are both trying to consolidate their power right now. There's an election happening next month, theoretically, in Russia that could extend President Putin's term essentially for the rest of his life as president. And obviously, MBS is putting relatives in jail and doing things to consolidate his own power. So they're both in the middle of a time where they're trying to establish their power, that sort of thing. Neither one of them wants to blink. Frankly, both of them, in particular Russia, is mad at us. Because over the last few years, where Russia's production stayed fairly stable, ours has gone up 3.4 million barrels a day in the United States. About 65% of that's been in the Permian Basin in the last 4 or 5 years. And so they don't like the fact that they're losing market share. And so basically they'll say, okay, we'll increase production and we'll drive the price down some more. And so they walked in intending to stabilize prices. They walked out taking them down into the $20 a barrel range one day, and it may well go lower as they do other things. Because once they did that, United Arab Emirates said, we're going to get in on this deal. And Kuwait said, we're going to get in on this deal. And so it's sort of become a self-fulfilling thing. It makes no sense for them to do this. And the reason it makes no sense for them to do this is very different for the two countries. In order for Russia to survive, Russia needs a higher price of oil than this. And Russia's oil production is very inefficient. They need a much higher price than this to survive. So they are not able to sustain this long term. They don't have a lot of liquidity. I think that they also recognize that people don't realize that Russia has 5 times the population of Texas. Russia's gross product is less than Texas. Russia is only a major power in the world that we talk about for one primary reason. The pipeline system in Europe allows them to pretty much control the access to natural gas in the winter for a lot of Europe where it gets really cold. And that is literally the primary source of their power. With the advent of liquefied natural gas, taking natural gas, shipping it around the world, we're very rapidly turning natural gas into a global market. When that happens, Russia's power in the world will dissipate dramatically because they will no longer have that power and control. So they're working on a fairly short time fuse in the sense of the scope of history here. And just from a sheer practical standpoint, they don't have the liquidity to do this very long. Saudi Arabia can still produce conventional oil. They're very efficient. They can produce oil at $8 or $9 a barrel and make some money. In terms of the production cost. But what has been done there is in order to maintain the political stability of the country, they use that oil production to give away a lot of free stuff. And they've actually attached a lot of that free stuff to the number of barrels of oil that is produced. So their fiscal break-even point for oil is much above where it is now. And MBS very much needs a stable social order right now because he's trying to consolidate power. And he doesn't have a great big army or something like that to kind of do it in ways that some folks have done it in the past. So the bottom line is both countries need the price to be higher, as do a lot of the other producing countries that are involved right now. The issue is who will blink first and when. And unfortunately, that is not an economic issue because you're basically dealing with two personalities who can't do this indefinitely, but they can do it for a while. And in the interim, the situation becomes fairly severe. If you remember 4 or 5 years ago, this happened in a way that Saudi Arabia in particular tried to drive the price down to hurt the U.S. shale industry. And they did a pretty good job of it. But back then, if they got the price below 75, they were hurting the industry. One of the dramatic things that's happened this time, or since that time, the response, and it was the perfect response, was let's lower the cost. Let's get the cost down. And producers have done a remarkable job of that. And some of the technologies that are being used now are amazing. And so, and basically, so now that number is probably in the high 40s somewhere, but it's not 25. And as a result, this is going to hurt. Last time around, the industry had access to a lot of capital because of the nature of the financial markets at the time, made a lot of capital available to them. There's not capital available to the industry right now. There's just not. For two reasons. Number one, returns in other sectors are better and under fairly normal situations, and right now everybody's in cash and nobody wants to take risk anyway. So it's a different situation in that sense, but the prescription remains the same, and the industry knows this. Lower the cost. Some of the large companies have said they can lower our cost below $20 a barrel in the coming decades. And once you do that, there's even less risk from these other countries. But right now, they can hurt us very badly. And last night, I was playing with our models and decided to look at what is the economic impact of this on the Permian Basin, making the same set of assumptions I was making with the U.S. And it's about $7.1 billion in gross product this year and around 26,000 jobs. I'm sorry, around 41,000 jobs. Now, to put that in perspective, the relative importance of it to here, the relative impact we face is well over twice as high as the relative impact the country faces. That is, if you adjust it for size, our impact's over twice that. And again, that 41,000 people is not, those are full-time equivalents, so a whole lot more people are impacted than that. And that's on a workforce of somewhere in the range of 200,000 or so. So you're talking about a very, very different situation when you start talking about the Permian Basin, a much harder hit here. And the policy prescription, in one way, is the same. And that is, the policy prescription is make sure we keep the structure together. Because what is different this time than the last time is, one thing we can learn from the history in economics, and this goes back a long, long way. There are Greek tragedies written about it. Aristotle wrote about it. I mean, this is something we've known. If there's one thing we've known in economics for a very, very, very long time, it's that people respond to incentives. And the incentive right now is for the emerging countries of the world to continue the growth path they've been on in the recent past and grow their manufacturing, and in the process use a lot of energy. And given that, there's going to be a demand for this energy that's produced here in the future. The critical thing is we have to keep the industry structure together to be able to take advantage of that. Nothing out there has changed. Again, nothing structural has changed. No fundamental assumptions about the economy have changed, other than the fact we have to weather our way through a very, very difficult health situation. But those fundamentals are going to look the same in a couple of years as they looked a couple of months ago, and that's going to drive demand. Now, a lot of people talk about about renewable energy, and we should. Climate is a very big and very real issue, and we have to talk about it, we have to deal with it. But part of the way we're going to deal with it is to burn hydrocarbons in a more clean fashion. And the industry is doing a whole lot of research about that right now. And the reason I say that is, if there's any other rule of economics besides people respond to incentives, it's when something has to happen, it will. And that's just the nature of how the incentive structure works and what part of what it drives. And if you look at all the potential development of renewables, battery technology, other technologies, you throw in a couple of black swans, and you look at the future energy demand in these emerging countries, we're still going to need a lot of hydrocarbons 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. It's just a fact that we're going to have to use them, and we're going to have to deal with the climate. And so it's going to take a complex joint solution there. A lot of people talk about electric vehicles. We just finished a study looking at those in the United States and Texas alone, not to mention the rest of the world. Just looking at the incremental patterns in electricity and how electricity is produced in this country. And with the incremental fuel being natural gas in a lot of cases, because electricity is made from natural gas and the electricity is going to power these cars, under any scenario you look at, you're looking at probably creating another 50,000 jobs out here by 2050 just to meet the incremental demand for natural gas for electric cars. So that's the situation we're in. Petroleum, hydrocarbons are going to be a part of the future. So the key is keep the infrastructure together so that we can be in a position to take advantage of that. That's going to take a very aggressive policy approach. At the national level, have to make the case of how important energy independence is. We see examples of that all the time. What's happening to right now with Saudi Arabia and Russia could happen in reverse, and they could raise the price up to unsustainable levels for us if we were not energy independent, if we did not have an ability to offset that. It's a critical, it's been a goal of this country for many years. We're essentially getting there very quickly now because of new technology, because of innovation in the industry. It's a very important goal. When you go to Washington, it's a tough sell. Number one, most climate advocates don't realize that hydrocarbons will be a part of our future. And I'm a climate advocate myself. I've done a lot of work on a lot of things to improve the environmental properties of things and that sort of thing. But I recognize the practical reality is hydrocarbons are a part of that. So you have that. And the other thing you have, of course, is people like cheap gas. And while high oil prices are important, or at least a certain level of price is important for sustainability of the industry, people like cheap gasoline. And so to some extent, you're sort of asking politicians to go against something most of their voters in most parts of the country sort of like. And so it's a very difficult sell, but it is critical that we get that message. It's also critical to get that message to Austin. This last year, in 2019, all the oil and gas industry paid about $3 billion in severance taxes in Texas. All-in taxes the industry was responsible for, with all the spill-off effects and that sort of thing, were about $8 billion to the state and about $6 billion to local governments. This is a very, very important part of the fiscal structure of the state, and that message is not always conveyed effectively in Austin. And so it needs to be a very, very, very aggressive approach to getting the things we need to sustain the industry. What a lot of people don't realize is if you look at the drilling, the services, the exploration, the production, the supporting industries, the pipelines, the ports, and the shipping, and the petrochemicals, and the refining, and the LNG, and everything else, and you look at those spillover effects, the oil that is, not the total industry, but the oil that is produced in the Permian Basin is responsible for 10% of the Texas economy, roughly. About 1.4 million jobs in the Texas economy, and a very, very large percentage of our output. So this is a very critical part of the economy. And again, the policy prescription is the same as it was in the nation. Forces are moving in the right direction in terms of the grand sweep of history here to make this a viable long-term industry, but you have to keep that structure together that's under a challenge right now. And that involves helping the workers who are suddenly out of work, and it involves helping the companies who support them, and both the service-related companies, the retail, that sort of thing, and the companies themselves, in order to sustain themselves through this situation and let the markets ultimately recover and do the things they do. And that's just critically important, and I don't think that message has been communicated. It needs to be done aggressively. We need to figure out policy options. A lot of people are proposing things right now. People have proposed, let's put a tariff on Saudi oil, and I've heard that from numerous sources. Bottom line is, as an economist, I'm not real fond of that one because I've observed about 4 centuries. I'm not quite that old, but in terms of studying history, I've observed about 4 centuries of tariff policy, and it all has one thing in common: it doesn't work. And that's not interfering with markets. It's not in that way. It's not a way to make the situation better. You heard some proposal, maybe we make a joint deal with OPEC and Russia to do something. I think that was premature at this point in time. It's certainly something that can be talked about as this evolves, but I think it's probably worthwhile to see who blinks to some extent, because neither one of those countries can sustain what they're doing right now for an extended period of time. But those are all things we can talk about. But I think the most critical thing is keeping this infrastructure of the industry together, keeping the structure together so that once we are through this and the world economy starts picking up again and the emerging countries are manufacturing and doing all the things they're doing, we are going to be in a position to continue forward with the industry and the advantage it brings to the country. So all of those things come into play here. The other thing I would say is I've talked a lot about how things kind of will get back to some semblance of normal. There will also be changes. Anytime you have something like this, we see some changes in our lives. Our attitude toward a lot of things changed after 9/11. Some things in our daily lives changed. We still, unless you have some kind of pre-clearance or something, you still take off your shoes when you go through the airport because of one guy, one incident. I mean, things change as a result of these things. Our perceptions of the world change. Our realization of vulnerability changes. These kinds of things happen when you go through something like this. And I think you'll see the same thing here. It's impossible to know what all of them are and what all of them will be. But I do think that a few of them are probably going to happen. Number one, as you know, there's already been a big focus in the last 4 or 5 years with companies on so-called ESG, environmental and social governance, that is being concerned about the welfare of your workers, the health of your communities, your infrastructure, and those kinds of things, your education system, your health system. I think we're going to put that on steroids. I think a lot of people are going to realize we need these systems to function very, very effectively in times of need, and that's going to be part of what corporations look at in the future. Is how do we make sure we can do everything we can to have systems that can support us going forward. I think you're probably going to see a newfound appreciation. As I said, John Locke, going back to the original Second Treatise on Government, that kind of formed the foundation of Western civilization, talked a lot about what we now call public health and safety. We've kind of neglected that to some extent over the last few years. I think we're going to start paying attention to it again because we're seeing what happens when you have holes in that system. I think you'll see that happen. A critical factor for the future is that the workforce is a key to the future. We had worker shortages before this. We have to come out of this with a healthy and vibrant workforce that can do the things we need to do. And I think you're going to see a greater focus on that workforce, its education, its training, its protection, and that sort of thing, because it's absolutely critical for the future. The final observation I'll make is, I hope this has been something that did give you maybe a call to action, maybe some better definition of the problem. But in terms of the hope and that sort of thing, the one thing I'll say is I had an experience a number of years ago where during President George W. Bush's administration, there was an economic downturn in the early part of his administration, and he did what most presidents do when you have an economic downturn. He had an economic summit. That's what most presidents do, and they bring a bunch of us together, and we talk about stuff and that sort of thing. And my assignment at that summit was to take a look at why the United States had performed so well for so long. Once you put aside the Great Depression, it's really been an outstanding run of economic success. And I thought it would be a fairly complex issue, but as I started looking at it, I determined it was very, very simple. We are successful because we do the next big thing. We innovate, we create, we make new things, and we are very good at it, and we're better than anyone else. And as the world has evolved and other people have gotten better, we've gotten better. And if you look at the fundamental patents in any new technology, we dominate. I mean, we do the next big thing very well. We don't necessarily do some of the older things all that well, but the next big thing is what we do, the innovation. It's the innovation and creativity of our health professionals and our energy professionals and others that are going to ultimately solve this issue and ultimately help us create that strength going forward. We've shown an uncanny ability to do that in the past, and I think we will in the future. I have timed this to talk just about the amount of time I want to talk. So I'm going to get Collin to come back up here with me now, and hopefully he has some questions and some dialogue and that sort of thing, and we can visit with you and answer some of your questions for the next few minutes.
Yeah. Ray, thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking time. Yes, we have some questions from the audience that we want to be able to share that we received over Facebook. Ray, I want to start with what I think is probably a really important individual question, and that was, as individuals, whether it's in West Texas, the United States, what can we do today, not just in our communities, but for and with our elected officials, whether that would be in our state capital or in our U.S. capital? What advice do you give us? We're sitting at home, we're glued to TVs and social media, trying to figure out what to do. Some of us are trying to keep businesses open. Some of us have had to make a decision to close businesses. Some of us are unemployed. So what do we do to help expedite, as you said, the important decisions that need to be made in our communities, in our states, and in our country?
Well, I think probably the most important thing is to very aggressively let them know what's going on in your life. I had a very good, very successful politician tell me once that the best lobbyist is not as good as the worst constituent. They want to hear.
Would you say that one more time?
The best lobbyist is not as good as the worst constituent.
Yeah.
They want to hear from the people who vote for them.
That's right.
And that's business leaders, that's folks who work in jobs, that's folks who are going through difficult family situations. But let them hear from you about what's going on in your world right now, because you have some vast philosophical differences up there. And as I say, down the road, people are going to be criticized. On one side of the aisle, they'll be criticized for voting for a bailout. On the other side, they'll be criticized for voting for welfare. And that's the way it's going to be. That's politics. But they need to hear from their voters right now that it's very important. Beyond that, the groups who can coalesce, the chambers of commerce, the industrial foundations, the folks with resources who can get to them and communicate to them what's going on and what they need and how they need it to happen. That communication effort is just absolutely critical right now. I mean, and it's a time where we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the essential. I mean, I would love to be able to go and study this for 4 months and come out with Ray's perfect plan to do something about this. We don't have time for that.
That's right. You said that history tells us that economies can recover quickly. So specifically, what would you tell your congressman if you were making that phone call, in our case, to Austin or to Washington, D.C., or wherever that is? I mean, will they really listen? Will they really get that information if I get online and I email them? Because cynically, many of us would say they don't have time to listen or they don't listen. But what should we be telling them specifically?
Well, they may not hear one particular voice, but what they definitely do is keep a count. There are people in their offices who know how many people are calling and saying this and that and the other thing. And, of course, some people have access to them. Some organizations have access to them in different ways, and that's very important to make use of that access right now. But the thing I would tell them is the thing I just said to the group here. We have to keep the structure together. That's the key thing from an economic perspective. The health perspective, we need to listen to those folks, and I can't help with that one. I don't do that. Right. That's not my role. But from an economic perspective, we have to keep the structure, what makes us functional, together. Because if we keep that together, then we're in a position to take advantage of things that will happen later and do the things we've always done. I remember an economist who some people like, some people hate. I think most people who hate him because they never read his stuff and don't understand what he really said. But a guy named John Maynard Keynes, who was very smart, back when the Great Depression first started, people were saying, well, we can't do this because that would create the deficit. We can't do that. We can't do the other because it'll all work out in the long run. And he made a very profound statement. He said, in the long run, we're all dead. And so that's a very profound statement to think about right now. We don't have time for some of the nuance we'd like to have. We don't have time for some of that. We need to move on.
And Ray, if you were able to sit down like you and I are today and talk to a small business person that is really struggling with trying to decide whether they're going to make payroll, how they're going to make rent, whether they should stay in business, if you could just talk to them, and I know you don't know the particulars, but what do you say to the small business people of America, and specifically to the Permian Basin, who I think you and I have talked that I liken the situation that we're in the Permian Basin to having a broken arm. And the compound fracture is the current coronavirus that we're dealing with. But the real break, right, is what we're going to do after that's solved. And we have to understand the reality of low crude prices for the foreseeable future. So what do you say to small business people?
Well, the thing I would say is obviously you have to do the things that you need to do to preserve your own business. You'll know your own situation. Each situation is unique. But one thing I would say is again, communicate to your local officials, to your state officials, to your federal officials. Communicate what it is you're going through. If you're part of some trade association, whether it's auto dealers or restaurants or hotels or whatever the case may be, get your message to the folks who communicate for you in those things. We have to be very, very aggressive right now. And hopefully these structures will provide some help to keep that together, because we're trying to communicate that message to Washington that whatever you do, you need to keep the infrastructure together. We've struggled, the good example of Permian Basin here. We've struggled for a long time to get the message. We needed infrastructure, we need education, we need those kinds of things out here in a bigger way because of the role we played. We need to do that in a way we've never done it before now. And a very simple thing, and this is going to sound crazy to some of you, but some of you have seen the stuff we put out a while back working with the folks over at PSP. Fill out the census form, because that really determines a whole lot of money we get for health care, for education, for infrastructure, for food, for all kinds of things. It's really critical we not have a big undercount here, and we're vulnerable because of the remote areas we have, because of the composition of our population. We're vulnerable here to an undercount. Fill out the census form. That's a very small thing, but it will make a difference in the resources we have for the next 10 years to battle some of the challenges we're going to be battling.
I'm going to let you take a drink, but I have a question. Could you reiterate for us the value and the importance of the Permian Basin to the state of Texas and to the United States?
Certainly. Let me say a couple of things I didn't say before. The Permian Basin, as an economy, is less than 0.2% of the United States. The energy sector of the Permian Basin is more than 20% of the energy sector of the United States. The incremental growth in the energy sector of the United States that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years, the Permian Basin is responsible for 2/3 of it. So while we're population center, we're a few 100,000 folks in a country of 300+ million, but we are an absolutely critical piece of the U.S. economy and the future of the U.S. economy. We're an absolutely critical piece of the world's economic future in order to provide the energy that's needed. Here in Texas, you can take the numbers, as I mentioned, if you take all in everything that comes out of what's here and what it generates, it's 10% of the Texas economy. And this is an almost $2 trillion economy here in Texas. Wow. They're very, very big numbers. But beyond that, we're part of the fabric of what's going to let the world grow and achieve its potential in the future. And there's all kinds of things that are happening. You really can't overemphasize just how important we are to Texas, to the United States, and beyond that, to the world, to the global complex of how we're going to do the things we need to do as a globe in the coming decades.
Well, thank you. One of the viewers asked the question, is there anything that you would recommend that we should do as a country in regards to foreign policy that would affect the stability or risk matrix for crude prices, foreign policy-wise?
Foreign policy-wise, I think there are a number of things that we can do. I mean, one thing would be to stop doing these stupid tariffs on things. We need to get to a world, the more open the world is, the better off we're going to be. Because we have a relatively open economy now, and every time we make a trade deal with somebody, we end up being a net winner. And it's happened over and over and over again. I've been involved in negotiating 5 or 6 of them. And it always happens we're a net winner. It's critical right now because we need to be able to sell oil to the rest of the world. I think that's a foreign policy issue that's very important. We need to really work on some of the regulations that restrict our access to some of the ports in various parts of the world, because we're going to be shipping, virtually every molecule that comes out of here is going somewhere in the world other than the United States. And so we need to be able to have access to the ports and access to that infrastructure and that sort of thing. And I think that's something. But basically, foreign policy is a huge part of the world. We live in a hugely complex, dynamic global economy, and we're seeing that right now. I mean, we're seeing the impacts of that right now. And so I think trying to have a foreign policy that's more open, invites more dialogue. I think we need to participate in the major agreements in the world. I think we need to, and I know this is controversial out here, we need to be in the Paris Climate Accord, because we are part of the problem and the solution to that, but we're not all of it. And I can tell you, as we solve it, we're going to be solving it with better use of hydrocarbons, because there is no other scenario that gets you where the world is going to go.
So is it fair to say that your statement about the climate and any of those topics is the only way that you really get an opinion is if you have a seat at the table?
Oh, I think that's a very fair statement. Is that you have to you have to be involved and shape that. And obviously, if you're not there, they're going to write rules you don't like.
Right.
I mean, particularly if you're as big as we are. But yeah, you need to have a seat at the table, and you need to be able to express some of the things I've just expressed here. I mean, I've said this to folks in various places around the world that part of the solution. I mean, I think when I talk about things the Permian Basin can do to build its future. One of the things I think it should be the epicenter of research on the environmentally responsible way to produce and burn energy. Because we have more expertise here than just about anywhere. There's no reason we can't be the epicenter of that, and water research and all sorts of things that come into play that play into this, because it's the kind of thing, it's not a simple single solution. It's very frustrating when you hear in the political debates that we've kind of gotten to the back burner for the last week or so here, a couple of weeks. But in the political debates, where you hear some folks say there is no climate change, and you hear other folks say ban all oil and gas drilling.
Right.
I mean, neither one of those positions is tenable. Neither one of those positions is remotely. They're both absolutely ridiculous, I guess I could say. It's one way to say it. And so, we have to work with people to make that happen. We have to have a more cooperative world to get the things we need to do put together. And it's complex. It's complex. I mean, again, I worked on some of the general tariff agreements before, like the World Trade Organization. You get 200 people in a room, and all of them have to agree on something. They all have their own interest and that sort of thing. Right. It gets very complicated very quickly, but you can make progress over time.
Yeah. I'd like to talk for just a second, and there's a slew of questions that have come in very specifically about the Permian Basin, West Texas, Midland, Odessa. What would your recommendation or your advice be to local citizens, local government, and even county and state government about how to address the fact that we have hundreds of people that are being laid off right now, obviously in a great extent because of the coronavirus and what we're dealing with health-wise. But we also know that there are people that are not directly in the oil and gas business, but as I had a guy tell me one time, he was a dependent oil man because he said he was dependent upon two or three things. One was the Lord, one was the price of oil and gas, and one was the Permian Basin. What's your advice? What do we do in West Texas as we kind of wrap this up today?
Well, as I mentioned, there will come a time when $25 oil won't matter out here, but it's definitely not today. This is a brutal, difficult time for our economy. The numbers I just mentioned a moment ago when I said, you lose 41,000 jobs on our scenario, and it could be more, it could be less, but just take that number as an annual average. That means you probably have twice that many individuals who are affected. That's a very, very large percentage of our population who will at some point in this process be without a paycheck. A lot of things are important. Our social structure is so important. The folks like over at the West Texas Food Bank who do such a good job, the folks that run the homeless programs. I mean, these kinds of things are very, very important. Our health professionals right now are very important. Support them as much as you can. To the local governments, I would say do anything you can to help ease people through this crisis, help ease companies through this crisis, and look at innovative ways to try to help things. A simple thing the federal government did, which was actually a very good thing, putting off the tax payments for 3 months.
Yes, absolutely.
Because if you're getting a refund, you can go ahead and file and get it. Otherwise, you still owe the same amount of tax, but in this immediate emergency situation, you freed up billions of dollars of cash.
That's right.
And that's what helps people sustain themselves. That can be the difference in a small business succeeding and not succeeding. Look at those kinds of policies as a model for the kinds of things you can do to bring immediate relief as we go. And again, I think it's absolutely critical that this, and I've said this for years, this area must have a much more aggressive presence in Washington and a much more aggressive presence in Austin, because we have a huge amount at stake and they have a huge amount at stake in our success that I don't think they always realize.
Okay. Thank you. Ray, in closing, is there anything else you would add before I make a few final statements and we let our folks go back to finding out what their new reality is today?
Well, once again, I just say I appreciate you and your team for putting this together under somewhat difficult circumstances, and the support that you give our community all the time, and the leadership that you give. We have so many folks in our community who are very good, strong leaders. My lovely bride Lorraine, among the most prominent of them, who do a lot of things every day to make this place better, and who are focused on this and working this. Our elected officials who are under a lot of pressure right now, our health administrators who are under a lot of pressure right now. I would say to all those folks, we appreciate what you're doing, and I would particularly say, to all of us, again, this is way outside my expertise, but listen to the health folks. This is a health crisis that's created an economic crisis. So listen to the health folks and do the things that we can to help with that. And to our local officials, I would say recognize this is a very difficult time. Your revenue is going to take a hit, and your needs are going to go up. And there's nothing, it's going to be a very, very significant hit in both directions. And it's one of those times we just have to do what we need to do, be bold and show the type of leadership to support our companies, to support our people, to support those in need, and to help move our economy forward. We have one of the most promising futures in the history of the world in this area right now. We just have to get through the next few months to make that happen.
There you go. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of my family, on behalf of our company, on behalf of our team, and this entire community, I want to thank you for taking time to listen in today. There are hundreds of places you could be. There are hundreds of websites you could be on, or social media sites. Thank you for taking time. Next week, we will be live again. We will send out that information and post it on social media as well with my dear and great friend, Andy Andrews. He's an amazing communicator, and he has the ability to offer great hope for all of us. Not from what we're experiencing today, but what America has experienced over its rich history. And so I hope you'll join me next week for another Sewell Leader Live. Our commitment to you is that we're going to be here through this entire crisis to try to provide people an opportunity to know what hope can really look like. And I want to applaud all of the churches and organizations throughout our region who have done everything they can to provide a sense of hope and peace that's so desperately needed. And to our city officials and our elected officials and to all the men and women in the Permian Basin around this country, and for that matter around the world, I leave you with one thought. There's a young generation of men and women throughout our nation right now that are looking up at the adults in the room, and they're watching us to learn how to handle the crisis of their generation. And I think it's incredibly important that just like the generation who led us through World War II, that we set an amazing example of hope and courage and peace around the people that we work and that we do this thing called life with. And so I would just encourage you to be an encouragement to other people today. And I've said this many times, and I'll say it one more time. If you don't have faith today, borrow someone else's, because borrowed faith is better than no faith at all. Thank you. May God bless you, and may you be a blessing to other people today. Thank you.